It was difficult to breathe. That blow to his chest had apparently done more damage than he'd initially thought now that the pheromones had worn off. It was as if his ribs had been wrapped in rubber bands, squeezing him tight. Drawing in breath was a conscious chore that he was painfully aware of, and every now and then, little spikes of agony would run through his ribs as he breathed. Still, there was nothing bubbling in his lungs or any other whistling sounds, so he was sure that at least they weren't punctured. That would have been really bad. He simply lay on the ground, too tired to do more than watch as changelings from other castes poured into the chamber and began their work on the captive diamond dogs. They were apparently going to be wrapped in cocoons. It wasn't exactly a fate that Caramel would wish on anyone, but given the circumstances, he was finding it difficult to dredge up much sympathy for them.
Alright, you've had your fun. Back to your posts. I want a full sweep of the passages and any loitering mutts rounded up and wrapped up by the end of this cycle,
shouted Overseer Skihar. She then glanced at a changeling who was nursing a broken leg and barked out another command.
And get the wounded to the nearest pod. We've had no casualties and I plan to keep it that way. Move!
The warriors were quick to obey, helping the injured to their hooves and herding them off to the tunnels that led upwards. Some even carried on their backs those who could no longer walk. Nearest pods? Caramel wondered. Were the injured going to be wrapped in a different kind of cocoon to heal up inside? Queen Chrysalis lingered to stabilize a few severely injured changelings that had been brought to her, one of which was Chitin. There was a nasty crack on her skull, and blue blood was oozing out of it. Her eyes were unfocused, and she was barely breathing. From his spot, Caramel watched as the queen sent tendrils of magic to the injured ones. The green magic slithered over their wounds, and the gashes and cracks shrank a little as they stopped bleeding. Caramel knew healing magic when he saw it, and it only made him more uneasy of the queen's power. Even the best of unicorn doctors struggled to perform that spell. The only ones who were known to reliably cast it were the princesses. But at the same time, some part of him couldn't help but admire that Chrysalis was treating the changelings herself and not leaving it to her subordinates. When Chitin hissed in pain as the magic worked on her head injury, Caramel thought he could hear the queen crooning to her. Huh, he said. He wouldn't have thought the queen to be like that. For all her talk of not tolerating weakness in the hive, she was being rather motherly.
Surprised?
Asked Rax, who was suddenly standing over him. Caramel glanced up at his friend, turned back to the queen, and nodded. Yeah.
Well, there's more on the way.
He raised an eyebrow. What's that supposed to mean? Rax responded by sliding a foreleg under him, hauling him back onto his hooves.
We'll show you. You can walk, right?
Caramel grunted as pain lanced through his skull, but nodded and took a shaky step forward. The world tilted sideways, and he cried out as he fell, but his shoulder landed on Rax's, and he mumbled his thanks as his friend helped to steady him. They headed to one of the tunnels heading upwards, which Queen Chrysalis was already ascending with the injured changelings in tow. Her healing spell apparently hadn't been strong enough to give them a full recovery. They were still groggy and unable to walk on their own, so she was lifting all 7 of them with magic. Silently, they followed the queen. It was difficult. Pain would shoot up his hind leg whenever he put his weight on it, and the throbbing in his skull was coming back. His chest was also hurting where Rax was holding him, but he held his tongue. His support was well worth the discomfort. One step at a time. You'll get there. Just don't think about how far it is. Something warm trickled down his cheek, and he paused to wipe it away. When he looked at it, there was a blue smear on his hoof. Wow, I'm literally blue-blooded. Too bad it didn't come with any of the perks that royalty seemed to enjoy. He chuckled and grimaced when his lungs wheezed in protest. They had to ascend a vertical shaft at one point, and Caramel had been forced to swallow his pride and allow Rax to help drag him up. The place that Chrysalis led them to was a chamber that he'd never been to before. It was somewhere above the level of the fungus farms if his sense of direction was anything to go by. It was cool and moist in there. Something about the curves of its ceiling and hollows in its walls gave the place a cozy feeling, and he found himself thinking that the place would have been pretty nice to live in if it hadn't been for the fact that the surface of its walls were coated in resin, and that runoff from the rains on the surface was dripping in. But deeper in, he changed his mind. The place was littered with the husky remnants of what looked like butterfly cocoons. Massive ones that were big enough for a pony to crawl into. Caramel's blood suddenly ran cold. Some of them were still whole and hanging from the ceiling, and he could see figures floating inside. Pony figures. And there were changelings all around the occupied pods, standing still with their eyes closed, pointing their horns towards the ponies within. Chrysalis called out sharply, and several changelings appeared from amongst the pods and out of nearby niches to assist her patients in tow. One by one, the infirm changelings were carried to a separate pod, and Caramel watched nervously as each one of them grew a little restless and struggled to get as close as possible to the sleeping occupants. "Oh no."
Caramel!
Someone cried out. "Sash!" He saw her rushing over from one of the pods. She nearly tripped over one warrior lying on the ground, but ignored his hiss of annoyance and skidded to a halt in front of Caramel.
What happened to you?
She asked, urgently inspecting his injuries.
"Diamond dogs,"
he rasped. It was still hard to breathe and speak properly.
As ponies would say, not bad for a rookie.
Rax added with a grin.
He just needs to learn to watch his back and be less of a dummy.
Come on, let's get you to a pod.
She urged, tugging on his foreleg.
You'll need to...
Caramel brushed her off and broke free of Rax's grip.
"Look, I just..."
He shook his head and glanced at the dozens of changelings around the pods. Their horns were glowing and green fire was dancing on their bodies, licking at their injuries. Their wounds shrank and closed, and it was like watching fire burning holes in paper, except in reverse. Waves of relief and glee flooded his senses as they experimentally flexed their limbs and peeled off the remaining scraps of damaged carapace still clinging to the sites of their now non-existent injuries. Those who were incapacitated were suddenly able to stand again, and those with lesser injuries looked like they were ready and itching for another battle.
"This is... your..."
Caramel suddenly found it difficult to speak, and it wasn't because he was having trouble breathing.
Yes, I work here,
Sash interrupted.
but we can talk about this later. You're injured, and you need help.
Yeah, sometime this century, please.
Rax added.
"But..."
He protested weakly.
No buts. Get moving, grub. Skihar is not going to be very happy if you aren't back in fighting shape.
Caramel's mind descended into a haze as he was bullied along by Rax, with Sash fussing over his injuries by his side. They brought him to a pod that wasn't being fed on by anyone and released him. It was hanging rather close to the ground, close enough that its upside-down occupant's head was level with his when he was standing up. It was too dark to see the pony's face, so he cast a little light on the pod. Sash said something in protest, but he didn't listen. It wasn't somepony he recognized. She was wearing torn clothing that looked like it had been taken through the wilderness and back, and her eyes were shut as she floated, unaware of the fate that had befallen her.
Caramel, look at me, please.
He turned to Sash. Her eyes were pleading, but her voice was firm.
I'm sorry that you had to learn it this way, but you need to feed. You're clearly having trouble breathing, and you're losing blood from that head wound. Doing this will heal you. Trust me.
"I don't even know how this is supposed to work,"
he growled.
I'll teach you.
She replied. He took a step backwards and shook his head.
Not this time.
Oh, you've got to be kidding me.
Rax groaned.
Are you telling me that you're getting cold hooves now? How could you not have figured out what goes on in here after spending all that time with us?
You're not helping!
Sash snapped at him. She turned back to Caramel and continued.
Please, we can deal with this issue later. Just get yourself fixed first, okay? You're not thinking straight with a head injury like that.
I'm guessing feeding on love heals us, right? Aren't I doing that with you already?
He asked.
I've been feeling it whenever you visited for a long time. Now I know why being with you always made me feel better.
It's not...
Sash frowned.
Hang on, you can do that already? You can actually taste my... emotions?
He nodded.
Well, that's... Never mind, we can talk about that later too. The point's that it's not the same.
Sash waved aside his protest before it even left his mouth. Then, pushing him towards the pod, she continued,
Love freely given empowers you, but that's not going to do a lot of good if you can't cast a healing spell. But our natural feeding will...
There's nothing natural about what you guys are doing here!
Caramel shouted, then doubled over as a fit of coughing overtook him. He felt her hoof gently touch his shoulder.
Please, don't make this any harder for everyone, especially yourself. You need help.
Caramel spat out a glob of phlegm.
Not the kind that you guys are offering. I'm not going to hurt any pony.
It doesn't really hurt them if you...
No,
he said. From the corner of his eye, Caramel saw Queen Chrysalis trotting over to them. He closed his eyes and concentrated on breathing for the moment. It was difficult to think when he was hurting all over. When he judged her to be close enough by her hoofsteps, he growled, Was this your plan all along?
You know enough to make an educated guess. Now do as you're told.
He looked up at her defiantly and shook his head.
I'm not going to be a part of this.
Rax and Sash fell silent as he locked eyes with Chrysalis. They stared at each other for almost a minute, neither willing to look away. Her face was unreadable, and he could not sense any of her emotions. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead when he realized that he might have crossed a line. He clearly remembered the first time he'd tried to act tough in front of her, and it was an experience that he didn't want to repeat. But instead of the retribution he expected, she simply sighed.
It looks like you're due for another lesson.
What?
Calyx, take us to the ones we caught last month.
Chrysalis said to Sash. Sash's eyes widened.
Those ponies, specifically?
Caramel eyed her suspiciously. She was clearly nervous, and he'd caught her eyes flicking over to him right after the Queen's request. There was definitely something there that she was trying to hide.
You heard me,
Chrysalis replied. Sash slumped.
They're this way.
Caramel followed her and the Queen, feeling a pit of dread opening up in his stomach. Sash led them deeper in, to a cluster of pods that were a lighter hue of green than the others, and a little glossier too. They were apparently newer than most of those he'd seen.
Go on, take a look,
said Chrysalis.
It's time your eyes were opened.
Sash stepped in front of him and said,
Wait, Caramel, please listen for a second.
He shouldered past her and trotted forward. The closest pod had a fairly large pony inside, a stallion judging by his size, but it was difficult to see his face.
Here goes.
Caramel lit up his horn and felt his ears droop. The greenish fluid distorted the colors, but it was clear that the stallion's coat was grayish and his mane was black. The four-leafed clover cutie mark was unmistakable.
Lucky.
His expression was rather serene, with the corners of his lips curled up slightly, as if he was simply having a pleasant nap. With his pulse rapidly rising, Caramel shone his light on the other pods and found Cherryberry in one, plus a few others whom he was sure he'd seen somewhere in Ponyville before. They all looked unharmed, save for the fact that they bore the marks of long and hard traveling.
Did they come looking for me?
It seemed possible. He'd not really bothered to cover his tracks because he wouldn't have thought any pony would have been crazy enough to follow him. And what were the odds that they would have found the same place? Unless... Caramel turned around slowly and glared at Sash.
Did you guys hunt them down? That's what you do, right? Huntercast and all that?
We do send patrols out from time to time,
Chrysalis confirmed.
And, well, your special somepony happened to be out that day and found your little rescue party out there, quite ready to die of thirst, actually. The poor little ponies hadn't planned their excursion very well, and after hearing the reports, I decided that we simply couldn't let them go to waste.
Caramel ignored the queen and continued to glare at Sash.
Well?
She averted her eyes and said,
They weren't in good shape when we found them. The Badlands can't support that many ponies in one place at the same time, and...
He snorted and waved aside her excuses.
I get it. You saved their lives or something. But why did you bring them here? Sash, they're your friends too. Why did you put them in...
He glanced at the pods and wrinkled his nose in disgust.
These things.
Because I told them to,
said Chrysalis.
I had no choice,
whispered Sash as she stared at the ground. Caramel remembered those words. Those were the same ones she'd said when he'd confronted her about the invasion of Canterlot, just before she left him.
No,
he growled, stomping a hoof in emphasis. He cringed as pain shot up his leg, but managed to not topple over and continued,
There's always a choice, and this isn't the right one.
And that's where you're wrong.
Queen Chrysalis placed a hoof on his shoulder and slowly but inexorably guided him closer to Lucky's pod until his face was just inches away from his unconscious friends, separated only by a layer of resin.
Until now, you've only been passively absorbing love from Calyx, and perhaps a little friendly companionship from your castmates. It's time for you to learn to actively feed.
Caramel coughed, but shook his head and backed away from Lucky. He turned and glared at Chrysalis, Sash, and Rax one by one.
You guys can do what you want.
He allowed his gaze to linger on Sash, and she seemed to wilt a little. He tasted bitter regret in the air, along with a tinge of concern.
I'm not going to be a part of this.
Chrysalis chuckled.
There's no need to delude yourself, my dear. You already are, and you are going to learn how to feed by practicing on your friend in there.
He bared his fangs and buzzed his wings in challenge.
Make me.
She smiled.
Only because you asked so nicely.
Chrysalis leaned in close, jagged horn aglow, and whispered,
Feed now.
Her voice had taken on a more resonant quality, and something about it was authoritative. It was difficult to think of a reason why he should refuse such a simple command. All he had to do was to take a few steps forward, focus on Lucky, and...
Pony feathers!
Caramel realized that he'd been doing exactly as he'd been thinking, and jerked away at the last moment. His magic had been on the tip of his horn, ready to reach into the pod, but he quickly reeled it in. He shuddered at the thought that he'd been so close to obeying the queen, and... An intense feeling of dread, guilt, and regret wormed its way up his gut at the thought that he was disobeying a direct order from Chrysalis.
Here, let me show you,
he heard her say. He could do that. It was easy enough, and better than listening to her first command. The gut-wrenching guilt subsided to a tolerable level.
Use your magic. Feel your surroundings. You can taste it, can't you? The sweet dreams of the pony before you. Reach out. Don't be afraid.
His vision grew blurry. He allowed his magic to flow out and gasped at the sudden rush of smells and lights. There were many clusters of them, each probably corresponding to a cocooned pony somewhere. The brightest one was directly in front of him, and he could sense the pleasant sweetness of nourishment. He found himself salivating.
It's called dream stalking. Dive in.
Caramel obeyed, and the world instantly became a billowing swarm of gray shapes and dark smoke. He caught glimpses of Lucky prancing around with several happy mares in tow. Then he saw a younger Lucky, laughing along with an equally young Shining Armor as they teased and made fun of other colts and fillies. Then there he was snuggling up to his parents as a foal. Flashes of other scenes blazed past him, and every time a happy or tender memory or fantasy did so, the surging, dark clouds would suddenly glow vibrantly with all colors of the rainbow.
Now, take it in. Feed,
said Chrysalis's echoing, disembodied voice.
Wait, no. Hasty, no!
Caramel tried to pull himself out of Lucky's dreams, but only managed to withdraw a little. He became partially aware of both his physical surroundings and the dream, unwilling to go back in and unable to fully drag himself out. There was that horrible feeling of guilt and dread again, like he'd been caught stealing and was awaiting punishment. He was also somehow acutely aware of his injuries. There were numerous gashes on his hide. Some of his ribs were fractured. He was losing blood. One of his lungs was now filling with fluid, and through it all, pain was coursing through his nerves like lightning.
No, I'm a pony. I will not hurt my friends.
Caramel groaned as the pain intensified. So did the unnatural guilt. With every passing second, it was as if he was committing another atrocity. Imaginary ones, he was sure, but they felt so real. He'd stomped on a puppy's tail and kicked it away. He'd slapped a foal when it cooed at him. He'd laughed at some pony's funeral and blown a raspberry at the coffin in front of every pony.
Please, stop!
One after another, his mind filled with all of the terrible things he was capable of doing. He whimpered when he felt like he'd flown into a rage when Shining Armor had teased him in school, leaping on him like a frenzied, rabid animal, and pressed both forehooves on his throat, throttling the life out of his classmate until his eyes glazed over. Tears began to flow.
No more!
Caramel dove back in, and as soon as he tasted what lay in Lucky's dreams, he realized how much he needed it. There was love in there, and it would heal his wounds. It would give him strength, and the flood of guilt would finally end. As soon as the thought occurred to him, he was beyond stopping himself. He fed greedily, siphoning off the love and happiness out of his surroundings. Almost immediately, he sensed fire rush through his veins, burning away impurities and knitting flesh back together again. And his power grew. He could feel it pooling in his magical reserves to be called on whenever he needed it. It was like the time when Chrysalis had shared some power with him to feed the nymphs. He felt invigorated and drew in as much of it as he could. When he was finally sated, he felt a shiver run through him, and the real world came back with a rush. He was just in time to see green flames dissipating around him before he dropped to the floor, panting after the bout of feeding.
Quite the appetite,
Rax commented dryly.
Looks like you just gave him nightmares.
Well, at least there's no permanent harm,
added Chrysalis. She was wearing a proud smile as she towered over him.
You've far more potential than I've given you credit for. You didn't even need lessons for slipping on your first disguise.
Disguise?
Caramel sat on his haunches and shook his head. Something was a little off about his body. He felt bigger and a little ungainly in his movements. Frowning, he inspected his forelegs and noticed that his muscles were a little more pronounced and his coat was gray, and the holes in his legs were gone. It was the same with his hind legs. He no longer had wings, and a quick exploration with his hoof told him that his horn was also gone. He looked back and saw that his tail hair was jet black, and his cutie mark of 3 blue horseshoes had been replaced by a green, 4-leaved clover. He stared blankly at the foreign cutie mark for a while. He could guess what had happened easily enough, but reconciling that knowledge with his heart was another matter. He glanced at Chrysalis, who was watching him in amusement, at Rax, who seemed half concerned and half exasperated, and at Sash, who was looking at him with a mixture of guilt and sympathy. He began to shiver.
I can't be seen like this. This isn't me.
He whirled around, looking for a place to hide, but there were changelings everywhere, watching him. When he glanced up and saw Lucky floating in the pod, with his face twisted in a slight grimace, Caramel uttered a cry of panic and frantically clawed at his gray coat.
How do you get this off?
He cried. He kept twisting and turning in an attempt to hide himself from everyone, unable to meet their eyes, but there was nowhere to run or hide. After scraping himself raw on his forelegs, he felt another shiver run through his body, and green fire erupted over his coat and ate away his false form. He sighed heavily as they faded away into wisps of smoke, leaving his familiar tan coat over dark, hard skin dotted with holes on his lower legs. His cutie mark reappeared, and he'd never been so relieved to see it in his life. With a feeble moan, he slumped onto his haunches and hung his head.
I really am an idiot. How did I not see this coming? This isn't right,
Caramel whispered to himself. He felt someone's hoof under his chin, and his face was lifted up. Chrysalis smiled at him and said,
Right and wrong is a matter of perspective. You've seen what we have to deal with down here. You know that some of your siblings would die without access to these reserves. And given your role in battle, I'm sure that you also know how valuable magic is in defending ourselves.
They're ponies. They have feelings. They have families.
Caramel felt his voice rising. Although he was emotionally worn out, he could feel his magical reserves bleeding in to compensate.
You can't just keep them here like, I don't know, things that you feed on like snacks whenever you feel like it.
He looked at Sash, Rax, Chitin, and the others who were standing around and growled,
And how can you guys just go along with this? This isn't right, and you know it. How would you feel if ponies threw you into jail or dragged you out of your homes or...
Caramel's next word died on his lips as the realization sank in.
We know,
Sash replied.
So did our ancestors,
said another changeling at the back.
It's hard being on the wrong side of the fence, isn't it?
Asked Chrysalis.
Your forebears drove us into this wasteland.
If you guys didn't try to steal love in the first place...
But even as he tried to justify their actions, Caramel realized that pointing that out would only lead to an endless game of blaming one another for past wrongs. There was nothing else to be said.
Whatever you may think, the facts remain. We live here because you ponies don't like us. Life is hard in our world, and many of us would die if we didn't make use of our abilities. Feeding on love is the most efficient and reliable source of magic, which happens to be what we need for nourishment and defense. So don't expect apologies from us anytime soon. And lastly, Your siblings do this because they have no choice.
There is always a choice, he whispered.
Not for us,
said Sash.
The Queen commands, the Hive obeys.
Almost all of the changelings said in unison.
Well, most of the time,
Rax added.
Caramel, slap Thorax for me,
commanded Chrysalis. He promptly got up and smacked Rax on the cheek. At his friend's surprised grunt, he blinked and looked at his hoof in shock.
What did I do that for?
Good. Now, hit Calyx.
Caramel turned to Sash and raised his hoof, but stopped at the last moment when she flinched. But then he felt a growing pang of guilt rising in his heart, and the memory of the horrible things he'd imagined he'd done surged back.
Not again!
Before he could stop himself, he'd already struck her on the face, far harder than he'd intended, and she was suddenly sprawled on the ground, nursing the growing lump on her cheek.
I'm sorry,
he cried out as he rushed to her side.
I don't know what...
It's okay, I'm tougher than that,
she interjected, gently pushing him away.
Get up and look at me.
Grinding his teeth in frustration, Caramel turned away from Sash and found himself face to face with Queen Chrysalis. She wasn't smiling anymore.
You are in our world now,
she said in a resonant voice.
And the first rule of the Hive is simple. Obey the Queen. So let me make this clear. You will not attempt to free these ponies or sabotage Huntercast in any way. You will not go to the surface or try to flee from work. You will not abandon your post and your siblings.
Her horn was glowing throughout her speech, and as each command was iterated, Caramel felt as if a growing weight was pressing down on his mind harder and harder. But when she'd finished and her horn stopped glowing, the pressure vanished. Her voice returned to normal after that.
But I'll be reasonable. You're still free to go wherever you please within your bounds. And so long as you continue to do your part as you have from the beginning, I will place no further restrictions on your freedom. You are still family after all. And I would hate to make you miserable after all you've given up for us.
Too late for that, he thought numbly. Chrysalis patted him on the head.
You're excused from duty for the next cycle. I'm sure you'll need the time to revise your understanding of how you fit into all of this. But I expect you to be back on duty after that. Your siblings need you.
Caramel had no words left. He simply stared at the ground in silence. After a while, he looked up and realized that the Queen was gone, and so were most of the onlookers. The only ones left were Rax, Chitin, and Sash, and a few other members of Huntercast working in the background, keeping a discreet distance from them.
Really now,
Chitin began.
There's no need to be so upset about this. You're all better now, and so am I.
She hopped in front of him and did a little somersault in the air.
We'd still be crawling around like slugs if we hadn't fed.
Leave me alone, Caramel grunted.
But, Chitin, not now. Give him some time,
Sash interrupted.
Oh, okay.
Chitin turned to Rax and announced,
I'm heading back down. You coming? Scritch and Mandy might be getting worried.
I'll come later.
Chitin nodded, then waved goodbye and cheerfully trotted off. Caramel watched until she was out of sight, then turned his gaze onto Sash, wondering what exactly he was supposed to make of her now. The others he could understand. They had no reason to treat Lucky and Cherry any differently from the rest of their prey. But Sash had been their childhood friend for ages, and he felt that she should have at least tried to do something to help them instead of dragging them underground. Sash simply gazed back in silence. It was hard to tell what she was feeling at the moment. Maybe she was guarding her emotions carefully now that she knew he could sense them at times.
Do you want me to go too?
She asked. He closed his eyes tight and nodded. More than anything else, her role in capturing Lucky and Cherry felt like a betrayal, and he was afraid that he would tear up if he looked her in the eyes. He could still feel the wetness from when he'd cried after strangling Shining Armor.
No, that didn't actually happen.
He angrily corrected himself.
I'll see you later.
There was silence for a few seconds, and then Sash whispered,
Please don't beat yourself up too hard, okay? Any pony else would have done the same thing in your place.
Just go. Please.
All right. I'll be around if you need me,
she said. When her hoofsteps had receded, he sighed and held his head in his hooves. He wanted to be angry at her for what she'd done and for keeping him in the dark for so long.
They'd been caught for over a month for crying out loud.
But at the same time, he could see that there was probably nothing that she could have changed. He couldn't expect her to fight all her siblings who'd been on patrol with her, and she certainly couldn't have done anything against Chrysalis. It was painfully apparent that changelings were physically incapable of disobeying direct orders from their queen.
And now, she's my queen too,
he thought miserably. If he couldn't fight against the compulsion even as a half-pony, then how could he expect Sash, a full changeling, to do the same? And now, they were trapped. They were both free to be with one another, but only within the confines of the hive. And it seemed that there was nothing he could do about it. Caramel groaned in frustration and whirled around, searching for something to wreck. He found a loose chunk of rock, seized it with magic, and hurled it as hard as he could against the wall. It exploded into 100 little pieces, leaving a powdery smudge on the wall and a cloud of dust.
Good throw, though you could have saved it for a real fight,
Rax commented. He was sitting in a rather comfortable position, nestled between a rock column and an empty pod, watching him. Caramel rounded on him and growled,
Why are you still here?
Full sitting,
he chirped. Caramel scowled and suppressed the urge to throw something at him. He wasn't in the mood for jokes.
I don't need a full sitter.
Rax was unrepentant, but he did wipe the grin off his face and replied,
Fine. It's my job to keep you safe, remember? I'm here to make sure you don't do something stupid.
Like what?
Rax narrowed his eyes and rubbed his chin with a hoof.
Oh, I don't know. There are plenty of ways to do yourself in if you feel like it. Strangle yourself, drown, poke the queen in the eye, whatever. It'd be pretty funny to watch you try, but Chrysalis would bust my shell and turn me into mushroom compost if you succeeded.
He then grinned again and added,
Can't let that happen. Priorities, you know?
Gee, how thoughtful of you. I feel so much better now,
Caramel groused.
Oh, that was unintentional. Do you think you could stay miserable for a little longer then? I don't feel like going back to the barracks just yet. It's much nicer up here. It's not so wet.
Enough was enough. He'd just discovered what Sash really did in the hive, and on top of that, he'd had his mind invaded and abused by Chrysalis and been forced to feed on his childhood friend like some dirty leech. Caramel leapt up and stomped over to Rax.
Look, you guys may find all of this normal, but I'm a little out of my depth here, okay? I don't even know what I'm supposed to be anymore!
He shouted. Rax raised an eyebrow.
You don't like being a changeling? Well, that's too bad. What were you expecting when you joined us? You really should have thought this through before coming.
I know that!
Caramel let loose an angry hiss and raised his hoof, but slammed it back on the ground instead of punching Rax's stupid face.
Hayseed, I hate you guys,
he said through gritted teeth. Rax laughed.
Are you sure about that? Because it looks like you're hating yourself right now.
So saying, he burst into green flames, and an instant later, a half-changeling Caramel was sitting languidly in his place, wearing a smug grin. He had the same dirty tan coat as he did, which had gone patchy in some places on his back and neck, and had completely receded from his lower legs, which were full of holes. His wings were almost full-sized, and the last patch of hair on his tail looked just about ready to fall off. His mane, although filthy, was still intact. All in all, it was the exact appearance he knew he had. Except the eyes. Due to the lack of mirrors in the hive, he'd not been aware that his eye whites had gone completely blue. His pupils remained the same.
Do I really look like that now?
He backed away a few inches and shook his head. There was no going back for him. He'd already crossed a line. The fake caramel gave him a toothy grin and asked in his own voice,
Like it? Enough, he warned. You'd better get used to it, because that's what you'll look like for the rest of... That's it!
Caramel roared as he leapt onto his doppelganger and delivered a swift punch to his muzzle. He then tried to pin him down with both hooves, but he flinched when the fake caramel snapped at his foreleg and kicked him in the belly. He fell flat on his back, but quickly got up and charged once more. They collided and wrestled for several minutes, tumbling all over the place, smashing each other against the walls and floor and trading blows. He grew hot and sweaty, but refused to quit until he'd beaten an apology out of his opponent. It wasn't until he bit down on his ear that he finally got a verbal reaction.
Ugh!
Rax yelped.
Oh, yuck!
He'd forgotten about his fangs. They'd pierced Rax's fleshy ear, and its hard, serrated edges felt crunchy between his teeth. When Rax tried to buck him off, he simply yanked harder.
Get off, you stupid... Ah!
Caramel refused to let go, even though the filthy, coppery taste in his mouth was beginning to nauseate him. Rax's wings buzzed futilely against his chest, and whenever he tried to shift to gain leverage, Caramel simply pulled harder and gnawed.
Okay, I give!
Rax whined.
Hayseed, I sound pathetic.
Pugh! Caramel released Rax's mangled ear and spat out a glob of blood mixed with his saliva. The taste lingered, though, and he gagged and chucked up a little splatter of bile onto the floor. When he'd finally gotten his stomach under control, he saw Rax shift back into changeling form in a burst of green fire.
Wow, I need to remember how sensitive pony ears are. Would have been really useful to know during the invasion.
Rax muttered, nursing his ear. It was no longer bleeding, but the damage remained. There were 2 holes in it. They did nothing but stare at each other for a while, panting from the exertion, but Rax eventually spoke again.
So, feel better after throwing your little tantrum?
Somehow, Caramel did feel better. Maybe changelings could only feel so many things at once before new stimuli crowded out their emotions. He slumped to the ground and sighed.
Yeah.
But after a moment, he grimaced and spat out another glob of saliva, saying,
Ugh, revenge definitely isn't sweet. You taste lousy.
Rax shook his head and smiled.
Not so fast. Guess whose form I was wearing when you bit me?
Oh, right. Caramel winced at the thought. That wasn't something he wanted to think of at the moment. He rubbed the back of his head and tentatively said,
So, thanks for that. I guess I needed it.
Rax frowned at him.
What are you talking about? I was just looking for an excuse to do something other than watch you mope.
Caramel gave a weak chuckle. Rax had a really unconventional way of helping things, but he couldn't argue with the results. But he knew that it wasn't going to fix anything in the long run. In spite of feeling a bit better, he was aware that his frustration and turmoil were still simmering at the back of his mind, and no amount of excitement or physical exertion was going to help him forget about his disillusionment. And what had Lucky and Cherry been doing out in the wilderness in the first place? Searching for him? And how many others were aware of the specifics of his disappearance? Before setting out to find Sassaflash, he'd certainly not announced his intentions to the world or anything.
Thanks for helping, but
I'm gonna need some time to sort this out, he said, staring at the ground as he traced patterns idly in the dirt with his hoof. I need to think about all of this. He then heard Rax smacking a hoof to his forehead.
Ugh, more boring stuff.
At least you're not the one dealing with it. Caramel remained silent as he lay down. No matter how much he wished it otherwise, things couldn't go back to how they were. Caramel awoke with a gasp, but instead of drawing in air, he felt something thick and viscous inside his lungs.
What the...
His movements felt ponderously slow, and everything was green and distorted, as if he was underwater. He reached out, and his hoof pressed against something that was tough yet stretchy. Panic rose in his chest when he realized that he was upside down and trapped with no air. But slowly, he found that breathing in the heavy fluid was relieving the burning in his lungs. And then the realization came to him. He was inside a changeling cocoon.
That can't be. I remember.
He joined the hive. He'd been set to work in Forager caste, then Keeper, and then Warrior, and he'd made friends with a few changelings, and Sash was there with him, and Chrysalis had been turning him into one of them. And then he remembered fighting the Diamond Dogs, and...
I fed on Lucky. Like a changeling. Chrysalis made me do it.
He looked at his hooves. Even looking through the thick liquid, he could easily tell that there were no holes, and his coat was all there. He couldn't feel his wings, and his magic was completely gone. He wasn't a changeling. He was still a pony.
It felt darned real.
Relief warred with panic. He'd not actually turned on his friends then. He wasn't going to become a changeling. But at the same time, he was now the prey rather than the predator. Maybe the changelings had just laughed at him and wrapped him up in his sleep during his first night. It was the only time they could have done it, before he was given his first dose of royal jelly. But before he could decide whether he liked this sudden turn of events, he glimpsed something dark at the edge of his vision. It looked eerily familiar. As his pulse quickened, he heard someone whisper to him. The voice was distorted and indistinct, but it wasn't something he'd imagined. He squinted at the dark, blurry figure outside of the pod. It was definitely pony-shaped, or it could have just as easily been a changeling.
Am I gonna get fed on?
A faint green line appeared in front of him, trailing behind a dark little dot that traveled down in a straight line. As he watched, the line fattened and curved out in the middle until it was more like...
Somepony's cutting me out.
Caramel braced himself as he spilled out of the cocoon. His fall was somewhat cushioned by the heavy fluid, and it took him a moment to right himself and begin coughing the stuff up and out of his lungs. It was as thick as honey and incredibly uncomfortable to bring up, especially after he'd gotten some air into his lungs. He took a deep, gurgling breath and choked out little globs of gunk at a time.
Be still. You are safe now,
a soothing voice said. Caramel froze. He looked up, slowly, and saw a wraith-like figure towering over him.
Chrysalis?
But in the next instant, he realized that it wasn't the queen. The figure was dark and blurry around the edges, but he could tell that she had no holes in her legs. Her horn wasn't jagged, and her wings were neither translucent nor serrated. He frowned as he peered at her. She wasn't quite black. The longer he stared, the more he thought that her body actually had color. Maybe blue. A blue so dark that it was almost black.
Wait a minute.
He whirled around, sweeping his gaze in every direction. The cavern's massive, dark expanse was filled with thousands of pods, and far in the distance, he could see the outlines of tunnel entrances that glowed with a deep, purple light. The shadows were angled in impossible directions in relation to the light.
What have they done to you?
Asked the Wraith. This time, the voice was distinctly feminine, but it also carried a steely undertone. Caramel stared at her once more, simultaneously fighting the urge to flee. Slowly, the wispy edges on her form settled, and he took in a sharp breath. Dark blue coat, feathered wings, a mane and tail that rippled and waved in the windless air, tiara and breastplate.
"I've seen you before,"
he murmured. Caramel awoke with a gasp, and this time it was air and not fluid that filled his lungs. He sat up and found that he was back in what he was starting to think of as the hive's love repository. Lucky and Cherry were still floating in their pods nearby, and so was every pony else. Farther down the cavern, he spotted several changelings hanging upside down from the ceiling as they wove strands of resin around a fresh pod. It was a little larger than the others, and when Caramel squinted, he realized that it was because the occupant was a diamond dog.
Guess this place doubles as a dungeon.
He got up and found Rax asleep right where he'd left him. He peered at him closely and sighed. Nothing had changed. After the dream, he'd entertained the hope that maybe some of the things that had happened in the past hours hadn't been real, but Rax's fractured neck plates and bitten ear were evidence to the contrary, and that meant that he still had a lot to think about. Not the least of which was the fact that he'd discovered what was responsible for his intermittent nightmares. Or more specifically, who. Now that he'd thought about it, they almost always occurred during the cycles that coincided with nighttime. He could finally put a name to the nameless shade that had chased him in his dreams.
Princess Luna.
Formerly, Nightmare Moon. If being forced to feed on his friend was like being thrown into the deep end of a pool and finding that there was a shark in it, then this new discovery was like finding there was a hydra in the pool too. He didn't know who was supposed to be scared of whom, or whether he was getting out alive once the winner was finished with the other.